Imagine standing before a mirror in the year 1700, and the reflection staring back at you is something from a nightmare. Your jaw protrudes so grotesquely that your mouth hangs open, unable to close. Drool escapes constantly from the corners of your lips as you struggle to form even the simplest words. Your tongue, swollen and oversized, fills your mouth like a foreign invader, turning every meal into an agonizing ordeal. Your spine curves unnaturally, forcing your head into angles that make you appear smaller, more broken than you already are. You are Charles II of Spain, the final chapter in one of history's most horrifying genetic experiments, and you are dying at just 38 years old. But the tragedy isn't just that you're dying young. The real horror is knowing, with a terrible clarity that sometimes visits the dying, that this was never your fault. Every ounce of suffering coursing through your veins was predetermined by the choices of those who came before you. For 16 generations, your family married cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, in an obsessive quest to keep their bloodline pure. They called it preserving divine right. They called it maintaining sacred Habsburg heritage. What they actually created was you, the broken endpoint of the most systematic inbreeding program in human history. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty didn't stumble into this catastrophe by accident. When they took control of Spain in 1516, they made a deliberate choice that would echo through 2 centuries of human suffering. Of the 11 marriages contracted by Spanish Habsburg monarchs between 1450 and 1661, 9 were between blood relatives. This wasn't occasional intermarriage for political convenience. This was a calculated program of genetic concentration, executed with religious fervor and defended with the certainty of divine mandate. The men who ruled during this period weren't the powerful, decisive monarchs that court painters portrayed in their gilded frames. They were victims, each generation more damaged than the last, trapped in bodies that betrayed them at every turn. And it all began with a man who seemed destined for greatness. Charles I of Spain, known also as Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, inherited the largest empire in European history in 1500. He was intelligent, politically shrewd, and appeared healthy enough to rule half the known world. But look closely at the portraits commissioned during his reign, and you begin to see the warning signs written across his face. An Italian diplomat who met Charles in 1517 described him with unsettling precision: a long cadaverous face and a lopsided mouth which drops open when he is not on his guard. Charles had inherited the earliest version of what would become infamous as the Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower mandible that made his mouth hang slack when he wasn't consciously controlling it. His inbreeding coefficient was relatively low compared to what would come later, but it was already higher than what any reasonable person would consider safe. And then Charles made the decision that would doom his descendants. Despite ruling an empire spanning continents, despite having access to potential brides from every corner of Europe, he chose to marry his cousin Isabel of Portugal. Her mother was his aunt, his father's own sister. The couple needed special permission from the Pope just to wed, and their son, Philip II, would inherit not just an empire but a concentrated dose of genetic damage that would define the rest of his life. If you're finding yourself drawn into these dark corners of history, these forgotten stories of suffering hidden behind royal portraits and official records, please consider subscribing. There's something powerful about exploring these truths together, about understanding that behind every crown and throne were real people trapped by the decisions of those who came before them. Your support helps us continue uncovering these stories that deserve to be remembered. Philip II took the throne at the height of Spanish power, but he also inherited a genetic legacy that would shape every decision he made. Born in 1527, Philip exhibited the classic Habsburg features from childhood: the elongated face, the hooded eyes, and that increasingly prominent jaw that made eating and speaking a constant struggle. But his genetic inheritance went far deeper than physical deformity. Modern historians believe Philip suffered from severe depression and possibly conditions on the autism spectrum, creating a mind obsessively focused on minute details while utterly incapable of the broad strategic thinking his vast empire desperately needed. His approach to governance reflected the mental rigidity that so often accompanies inbreeding depression. He became fixated on religious orthodoxy, transforming the Spanish Inquisition into an instrument of unprecedented brutality. Court records reveal a man who would spend entire days crafting single letters, rewriting them over and over to achieve what he considered perfect wording. While crucial strategic decisions languished in neglect, his advisors watched helplessly as he drowned in administrative minutiae while the empire began its slow collapse around him. Philip married 4 times, each union a desperate attempt to secure male heirs for the succession. For his 4th and final marriage, he returned to the family's dark tradition and married his own niece, Anna of Austria, his brother's daughter, 22 years his junior. Their union produced Philip III, who would carry an even more concentrated dose of Habsburg genes into the next generation, and the nightmare would deepen with each passing year. Philip III, born in 1578, represented everything catastrophically wrong with the Habsburg approach to monarchy. Contemporary accounts describe a man mentally slow, physically weak, utterly dependent on advisors to make even the most basic decisions. His inbreeding coefficient was so dangerously high that modern geneticists consider it remarkable he survived to adulthood at all. His physical appearance shocked even courtiers who had grown accustomed to Habsburg peculiarities. His jaw protruded so severely that he couldn't close his mouth, causing him to drool constantly. His food had to be pre-cut into tiny pieces because he lacked the jaw strength to chew properly. His speech was nearly incomprehensible, slurred by a malformed mouth and an enlarged tongue that seemed to fill every available space. But perhaps more tragic than his physical deformities were his mental limitations. Philip III was described by those who knew him as having the mental capacity of a child. He was deeply religious, but in a superstitious way that suggested cognitive impairment rather than genuine spirituality. He believed in omens, spent hours each day in repetitive prayer, and left the actual governing of Spain to a series of favorites who exploited his weakness for their own enrichment, while he focused on religious ceremonies and elaborate court etiquette. Spain lost control of the Netherlands, watched its American colonies drift toward independence, and faced multiple bankruptcies. The empire that had dominated Europe for a century began its irreversible decline under a king who could understand what was happening around him. Philip III married Margaret of Austria, yet another cousin, and their son would become Philip IV. The genetic experiment continued. Philip IV ruled for 44 years, one of the longest reigns in Spanish history. But length didn't equal quality or competence. Diego Velázquez's portraits show us exactly what centuries of inbreeding had produced. The classic Habsburg features, taken to an extreme: that protruding jaw, the elongated skull, those hooded eyes that seem to stare with vacant incomprehension at a world slipping away. Court records describe a man who would remain in his chambers for weeks at a time, refusing to see visitors or attend to state business, sometimes talking to paintings as if they were real people. His first wife was a cousin, and their marriage produced several children who died in infancy or childhood. When she died, Philip faced a succession crisis and followed family tradition once more, marrying his own niece, Mariana of Austria, his brother's daughter, in one of the closest blood relationships in Habsburg history. This union would produce several children, most dying young, but one son survived, Charles II, born in 1661, who would represent the absolute nadir of royal inbreeding. Charles II entered the world already bearing the accumulated genetic damage of 16 generations of cousin marriage. His inbreeding coefficient was 0.254, higher than what's typically seen in the children of siblings. From birth he was obviously horrifyingly different. French court records described an infant with herpes-type rashes, a head covered in scabs, and a kind of channel that oozed constantly from his right ear. Charles never learned to walk properly. His legs were weak and malformed, his spine unnaturally curved, his balance so poor that he needed constant support. He didn't speak his first words until age 4, and even then his speech was so slurred that only his closest attendants could understand him. That famous Habsburg jaw reached its grotesque peak in Charles II. His lower jaw protruded so far that he couldn't close his mouth or chew solid food. Meals became ordeals of careful positioning and painful swallowing. His mental capacity was severely limited. He couldn't read or write beyond a basic level, struggled to understand simple concepts, and often seemed confused about where he was or what was happening. The Spanish court gave him a nickname that reveals their desperate attempt to explain the unexplainable: El Hechizado, the Bewitched, because they couldn't conceive how someone could be so physically and mentally impaired without supernatural intervention. They subjected him to constant exorcisms, believing evil spirits possessed him, never understanding that the true curse was written in his blood. Charles II married twice, both times to foreign princesses, horrified by his condition. His first wife reportedly flinched when he tried to speak to her, visibly repulsed by his appearance. Neither marriage produced children. His genetic damage had made him physically incapable of reproduction. On November 1, 1700, just days before his 39th birthday, Charles II died. His death certificate listed various immediate causes, but the real cause was obvious to anyone willing to acknowledge it. He died because 16 generations of his ancestors had chosen genetic purity over human welfare, divine right over basic biological reality. With his death, the Spanish Habsburg line came to an end, and with it ended the most extreme experiment in royal inbreeding that Europe had ever witnessed. The empire that had once dominated the known world fractured and faded, brought down not by foreign enemies or military defeat, but by the accumulated weight of choices made in royal bedchambers across 2 centuries. The story of Charles II and the Spanish Habsburgs is just a historical curiosity or a grotesque footnote in the annals of European royalty. It's a stark reminder that no amount of power, wealth, or divine mandate can override the fundamental laws of biology. These weren't monsters or villains, they were human beings, trapped by tradition, crippled by the certainty of their own superiority, victims of an ideology that valued bloodline purity above human suffering. And Charles, that broken man staring into his mirror in 1700, was the final proof that some prices are simply too high to pay. What strikes you most about this tragedy? The willful blindness of the Habsburg family, continuing their practices generation after generation despite the obvious suffering, or the fact that Charles II, perhaps the most genetically damaged monarch in history, was treated as divinely appointed to rule millions of people. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because these aren't just stories from the past. They're warnings about what happens when ideology trumps reality, when tradition becomes more important than truth.